U.S. Steel had people worried about their jobs, and understandably so. They spent a lot of money trying to brainwash everybody into thinking this is good.
Welcome to the first episode of the Labor Notes podcast, a new show from the folks who put on the Labor Notes conference every 2 years. I'm Danielle, a Labor Notes staff organizer based in New York City, and, as you may have guessed, a co-host of the pod. I also work with and write about K-12 educators, postal workers, and the Canadian labor movement.
And I'm Natasha, co-host of the Labor Notes podcast and a staff writer and organizer out in Philly, reporting on immigrant worker campaigns, the Mexican labor movement, and workers organizing towards international solidarity.
We'll be talking each week about the strikes, contract campaigns, shop floor actions, reform caucus organizing, and union elections that our staff and rank-and-file workers in the labor movement's troublemaking wing write about all year long. We'll also share strategies for stewards, contract action team members, grievance committee members, and really anyone organizing in their workplace.
Labor Notes is a media and organizing project working with union members who are building a fighting labor movement. We're at picket lines, shift changes, rallies, and network meetings reporting labor news from the rank-and-file perspective.
And we connect workers at our workshops, in-person troublemaker schools around the country, and at the Labor Notes conference every 2 years where reform-minded union members can meet one another and talk about shop floor actions and organizing strategies that work. The quote we heard at the start of this episode was from Don Furco, former president of the United Steelworkers Local 1557 in Pennsylvania, who spoke to Labor Notes editor Jenny Brown last month about the Japanese steel manufacturer Nippon's blocked attempt to buy U.S. steel. Jenny's piece, Blocked Nippon Deal is Lesson on Tariffs, Workers Need a Say, ran on our site on February 18th. You can read it at labornotes.org. It's also in our March issue of Labor Notes magazine.
There's a lot going on in this story involving tariffs, rank-and-file power, and even creepy employer phone apps and propaganda. But it is fundamentally about how the future of American manufacturing depends on workers having a say in its direction. We have Jenny Brown, who reported this story, here with us today. Welcome, Jenny.
It's great to be here.
Jenny, a lot of mainstream coverage has been portraying this deal as a net good for U.S. steelworkers. Why do you think that is, and what's missing from that perspective?
Well, what's missing is that what U.S. Steel employees, the rank-and-file members in the union, actually think about it and why. The basic story is that last year, Nippon Steel tried to buy U.S. Steel for $15 billion, but government regulators blocked the deal in January. And the cabinet officials that were tasked with reviewing the deal, they extracted some pledges from Nippon, but it wasn't really enough. And so they deadlocked 3-3, and the decision fell to President Biden, who then blocked the deal. And what I found interesting was that the companies spent tens of millions of dollars trying to sell the deal to the members of the United Steelworkers, especially those who work at 3 really huge facilities in the Mon Valley. And it's true that the plants they work in have been victims of underinvestment by U.S. Steel. So Nippon sort of went on a charm offensive and claimed that it would pour billions in new investment into the plants, and then, in addition, give a $5,000 bonus to each worker.
Where did United Steelworker members actually land on all this?
Well, the union officially opposed the deal, and so did most members. But the business press really portrayed this as a disagreement between, quote-unquote, union bosses and the rank and file, which is really far from the truth. Both the companies were really giving U.S. Steel employees a hard sell. The workers were getting nonstop company emails and presentations in their plants. They were seeing billboards popping up near where they lived. They were getting ads on their phones, which, by the way, this is a whole thing now. Employers like U.S. Steel and Boeing have been asking their employees to download these apps, to keep up with important information like negotiations or bonuses. But then they use those applications to inflict propaganda on their workers. Managers went around the plants asking workers to sign a pro-deal petition. They paid workers overtime to attend rallies at one of the plants and also at company headquarters. They were really trying to make it look like the workers supported this, but the workers that I talked to noted that at both of those rallies, they were mostly attended by managers, and they could tell because they were wearing white hard hats. Even with that, it wasn't really working to convince very many workers. And Don Furco, the local 1557 president that we quoted at the top, said that that's when the company's tactic switched to threats. Like U.S. Steel said they would start shutting down facilities in the Mon Valley, which is southeast of Pittsburgh. And they even threatened to move the work to non-union facilities, which the union charges is illegal, an illegal anti-union measure. So that was the situation.
Why do you think the employees weren't buying the propaganda?
Well, for one thing, before all of this, U.S. Steel had really shown its intention to move away from producing steel from scratch, which is what they do in the Mon Valley. And that's what you need blast furnaces for. There are 2 blast furnaces at Edgar Thomson Works in Braddock, which is one of the little towns involved. And then there's a coke works in Clairton, which also supplies coke to make the steel. U.S. Steel was already backing away from its Mon Valley plants and moving investments south to its non-union Big River mini mill facilities in Arkansas. And there they have electric furnaces that recycle scrap steel instead of making it from scratch. The workers in the Mon Valley told me that U.S. Steel even promised a lot of investments with big fanfare a few years ago, and then about 2 years into the changes, they did an about-face and moved their new equipment to the non-union facility in Arkansas. And there was really no reason for them to believe that Nippon had any different plans. Members saw Nippon's game there as an end run around tariffs. And this was because Nippon was hit with 29% tariffs that the Biden administration had put on them because they were caught selling their steel at artificially low prices in order to drive U.S. competition out of business. So from Nippon's perspective, what the steel workers told me is they could just bring steel slabs from overseas, roll it out in the U.S. and avoid the tariffs that way. And they would have an incentive after they bought U.S. Steel to shut down the remaining blast furnaces because they already have a lot of blast furnace capacity in Japan and in other countries. Then they could just use the U.S. Steel's rolling facilities that they had purchased.
So what was in it for U.S. Steel then?
Well, if U.S. Steel had been sold in this deal, its CEO would have made $72 million in cash and equity. So that was one reason they were really for it. The other top executives were going to split another $83 million. So you can imagine why they were pushing this really hard. And they pushed the idea that this deal was in the workers' interest when it was actually just in their interests. But the PR offensive did sway some workers who I think rightly were concerned about their jobs under U.S. Steel ownership because of the disinvestment that they'd seen already. And this all came to a head in the middle of the presidential campaign last fall. This didn't fit in the article, but there was a small group of workers who disagreed with the union's endorsement of Kamala Harris and supported Donald Trump for president, and they formed a group called Steelworkers for Trump. Even though both candidates, both Harris and Trump, were against the deal, the company reached out to the Trump-supporting workers to try to convince them to push the deal and maybe even push Trump to support the deal. And they convinced some of them. And those workers even went to one of Trump's rallies. And when they were welcomed up on stage with their Steelworkers for Trump gear, they presented Trump with a hard hat and everything. They took the opportunity to ask Trump to support the deal, which he didn't do. So this is interesting to me because U.S. Steel was using the existing disagreements in the union over the presidential election to try to drive an even bigger wedge between the workers and the union.
Were there specific worries the workers had about the consequences of the deal if it went through?
Yeah, the workers I spoke to told me they were worried about being swallowed up by Nippon, which is a multinational that's about 4 times the size of U.S. Steel. So the company would have the resources to starve out the union was one of their worries. they're already dealing with U.S. Steel undermining the union by shifting production to the non-union facilities in Arkansas. But this would further weaken them, they thought. And they also thought Nippon would not keep any promises because it refused to interact with the union or put anything in writing. And it's interesting because the union was actually proven right. After the Biden administration blocked the deal, Bloomberg revealed that there had been talks between the government and Nippon had negotiated a clause canceling any investment commitments in the event of strikes or lockouts. So this was designed, obviously, to tie the union's hand, right? You'd be under the gun, you couldn't strike. But also, the workers pointed out, the company could lock them out just to void any written pledges they made to the government. No, workers don't have control over whether they get locked out. And they're also worried about their pension fund, which is substantial. They thought Nippon might try to raid it.
Jenny, you mentioned that part of what was maybe distorting workers' actual impressions of the deal in a lot of coverage was the fact that their dissent wasn't being quoted as much, while supportive voices were being elevated. How did you find workers who had more of a finger on the pulse of what their coworkers actually thought? And what did you learn from those conversations?
Well, actually, it was really easy to reach people, and they were eager to talk. So I think the distortions came from company pressures on mainstream journalists and outlets. Other reporters even talked to the same workers I talked to in some cases, but the workers they interviewed told me they weren't quoted, or they were just the one anti-deal voice among a chorus of people being quoted to back the deal. And in particular, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, where workers have been on strike since October of 2022, sent a scab reporter who was basically a mouthpiece for the companies. And some workers refused to talk to him, of course. So I think basically this is a problem of the mainstream media being influenced by all of this money and propaganda that the companies were producing.
You also noted that avoiding tariffs might be part of Nippon's incentive to buy U.S. steel. We're hearing a lot about tariffs right now with the Trump administration going back and forth on imposing them on various countries. Is there a way to have tariffs that would actually be good for workers?
Yeah, I think this story really shows that you can have tariffs that are actually not that good for workers because the way they're designed, companies can skirt them, and in the process of quote unquote investing in U.S. plants could actually make things worse by busting the union or shutting parts of the plants. U.S. Steel, for example, still doesn't want to invest in its own basic steel plants, and steel tariffs alone are unlikely to change that. You need an industrial policy to encourage that kind of investment. And the Trump administration, as far as I can tell, is using tariffs basically as a tool of foreign policy rather than to encourage important industries. So every few weeks he changes things around. So even the big companies that otherwise support him are grumbling that they can't plan anything because they don't know what the costs are going to be. But it's even worse than that, really, because the Trump administration is actively against having an industrial policy. They've been canceling the commitments made by the Biden administration in the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the CHIPS Act. A lot of IRA money was supposed to go for the transition to lower carbon energy to protect the climate. A lot of money was going to wind farms and battery plants, and that money is being canceled out, the money that hasn't been spent yet. So from the standpoint of workers in steel and elsewhere, this is going in the wrong direction, which any union in these sectors could tell you.
Have there been any updates to the situation since the story ran?
Well, both the companies sued the union on bogus charges that it colluded with another steel company, Cleveland-Cliffs, to block the merger. The union moved to dismiss that suit on February 5th, charging that the companies are trying to stifle their free speech rights. And then most recently, the union filed charges with the National Labor Relations Board, charging that the company intimidated workers for speaking out against the deal and violated labor law in various ways, including by threatening to move work. And then we just had one of these bizarre Trump world detours happen. There was a press conference with the Japanese prime minister a few weeks ago, and the president announced that Nippon, which he mistakenly called Nissan, said that it would invest the money but not actually take ownership of U.S. Steel, which seems highly unlikely, given business practices. It's just not something that a company would do. And then Nippon refused to comment on this, and so apparently it was a mirage to begin with. But it does indicate that the deal may not be completely dead yet. So the union is still on the alert.
Thank you, Jenny, for the reporting in our episode today. You can read her story on labornotes.org. If you want to read a physical copy or hand them out to your friends, family, and union coworkers, subscribe to our magazine. You can find the links on our website, labornotes.org, and on our Linktree page, linktr.ee/labornotes. And don't miss our upcoming events in March, including the Labor Notes National Call on how federal workers are organizing right now. That'll be on Monday, March 17th at 8 p.m. Eastern. Then, we have a workshop for K-12 educators on organizing to protect immigrant rights and public education on Tuesday, March 18th at 7:30 p.m. Eastern. And we also have our March Stewards workshop on Monday, March 31st at 7:30 p.m. Eastern on the topic of investigating grievances. You can find all our events and register for them at labornotes.org/events. Also, you can help us keep doing this work and build the troublemaking wing of the labor movement by becoming a monthly donor or making a one-time donation at labornotes.org/donate. We're proud to rely on small dollar donations by union members who are building a fighting, multiracial working class movement.
That's our episode today. We want to give a big thanks to all the supporters who help make Labor Notes possible and the workers who are putting the movement back in the labor movement. And we want to thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. The Labor Notes podcast is produced by Sindhu Sundar, Natasha Elena Ullman, and myself. Our title music was written and performed by Labor Notes labor climate organizer Keith Brower Brown. Until next week, solidarity, y'all!